to recapitulate our position in our study of this life divine, Sri Aurobindo is describing how the spiritual being evolves out of the mental being. This is the current passage of human evolution, and it is the most important question before us. How is this evolution taking place, and how can we consciously participate in it? There is no other question more important than this, because the future of humanity rests on the spiritual evolution, when all that we have achieved so far and the best that mind could offer has only brought us to the brink of disaster. Unless a deeper, higher, truer principle takes over, there is no question of human survival. And so, this is the crisis before us, the emergence of a spiritual consciousness, and yet it must emerge out of the mental. It is not going to replace the mind by knocking it out, but it has to emerge out of mind itself, into which it had involved itself. In the same way as mind involved itself into life and life into matter, and so the sequence of emergence is inevitable. In the discussions we have had so far, Sri Aurobindo has pointed out that the primary driver of evolution has always been nature. Although human consciousness, now becoming aware of this, can participate and even lead the higher possibilities of this evolution without waiting for nature's slower process. But yet we have to recognize where nature has brought us already, what were her intentions and means of bringing us to where we are, so that we may pick up where we are and build from there. And for this, Sri Aurobindo points out that nature follows four broad means or lines of development which lead the human consciousness to discover its own deeper spiritual possibilities. The first line of development has been religion. The second line of development has been occultism. And we saw that religion leads us to enter in relation with the divine being as the highest divine being, or the many beings, secondary or tertiary, through which we begin to recognize divinity in all its aspects. Occultism leads us to the discovery of our own deeper and higher ranges, because we are not this little piece of consciousness that is struggling on the surface. We are something much more deep, but it is hidden, occult. And so discovering, uncovering, recovering all those layers and ranges is part of our evolution. Third, what he has described as spiritual philosophy, where the mind itself engages and organizes in the linkage between spirit and mind and all these deeper and higher ranges, and formulates an understanding of it. And the fourth has been a direct experience, which may happen without any mental understanding, it may happen without any occult prior awakening, it may happen without any religious dimension. These are the four lines that nature has already used to lead us towards this spiritual evolution. In that, Sri Aurobindo described how everywhere the process of nature is to help this emergence or lead this emergence of a higher principle through three stages. In the first, it is a vague, unformed, unclear, struggling, impulsive tendency, a vague urge. In the second stage, it comes into its own, can be recognized as what it really is, and we can see the spiritual principle now taking charge. And there's the third stage where, having taken charge on its own, it now begins to organize itself and expand its possibilities and completely change the prior stages through which it has emerged. The spiritual takes up the mind, transmutes the mind, life, and matter. So the third stage we have not yet reached. The first stage certainly we have seen, or we have as a humanity been through for the last many thousands of years, and perhaps longer. We don't really know the full journey of the earlier stages of the awakening. But we are somewhere in the second stage, and in the early part of the second stage, where we are beginning to recognize, at least in some individuals or in some collectives, that spiritual consciousness, it is distinct enough that we can say, yes, this is it. But it has not yet come into its own. It is not able to yet stand out, separate from the mind, and turn upon mind and seize mind and say, I will lead you. That has not happened. Neither in any collective consciousness, nor in any significant number of individuals. The few in which it has happened as individuals are looked upon more as some kind of an exception. We give to them names, we call them saints or sages or great yogis, but we see them more as exceptions rather than a normal emergence that all human beings should be able to have. Having had this background, in the immediate last paragraph that we studied, Sri Aurobindo points out that the first beginnings of religion must necessarily be crude, because that's the first stage in which an impulse is coming out. But the impulse pushes against all the resistance, and the resistance involves an inferior, coarse, dull material, whether of mind or of life energy, impulses and desires, which necessarily warp, distort, cover the true impulse which is emerging. And we saw lots of examples of that, how the ignorance can even be injurious, disastrous elements can creep in, lead to error and evil, including, as we have seen, great wars which have taken place on the grounds of religion, sometimes in the name of religion, sometimes in the name of God. And all of this fanaticism, militancy, oppressive self-affirmation of the vital is the tendency of the old life impulse and the crude ego trying to seize upon a higher emergent truth and use it to justify itself. Equally, the intellect can catch that and twist it to justify itself. All of this he has largely mapped out, and you will recall the discussion on the checkered history, which belongs to all human effort, not just religion. And so he says, if you have to criticize religion for these failings, you will also have to discard all man's actions, ideals, thoughts, arts and sciences, which have had to go through similar passage equally. Having recognized this, we move now to the next paragraph, where Sri Aurobindo points out that through all this initial apparent darkness of the emergence, there is still a great truth. And he shows us what is the deeper truth behind the religious impulse, in what way it will justify itself, and in what way or why it has failed. So first we saw in the previous paragraph, when the lower tries to reach out to the higher and fails because it tries to reduce the higher to its own terms. But now what we will see is the higher, when it penetrates, how the lower fails to receive. It's a different perspective, as if top down. We will see the truth that religion represents, but we will see the failure in the receptacle of the human vessel. So this is the paragraph now. Religion has opened itself to denial by its claim to determine the truth by divine authority, by inspiration, by a sacrosanct and infallible sovereignty given to it from on high. It has sought to impose itself on human thought, feeling, conduct, without discussion or question. Now, this is in a very brief statement summarizing all the different kinds of failures of religion, and we will go through each of these words. But then he points out why. Somewhere we sense in the very claim of religion to say, I know and you should follow because I know, we sense that yes, there is a truth. In fact, it could not have been possible for religion to claim this if there was not somebody or some experience in which the religion or the person representing the religion says, I know, and people say, yes, he knows. If that was not possible, religion would never have grown the way it has. And so he points out why it has failed. This is an excessive and premature claim. So the failure was that something greater was found, but the claim itself was an exaggeration representing a still higher possibility not yet reached. It was premature. And we will see more of that later. But keeping this in the background, let's review what are the points on which religion has claimed and has therefore opened itself to denial, because the claims have failed us. So religion has opened itself to denial by its claim. To what? First, determine the truth by divine authority. You will see this especially in religions which are based on the book. It is an odd, unusual idea in India, but quite common in the West and particularly the Middle East, where people call themselves as people of the book. They define themselves in terms of the book, not a book, the book. There is only one, the true book, and we are people of the book. And it feels strange, and in the East, it's not understood. It's very easy for somebody who's grown up in India to say, yes, all religions are the same. But the person who belongs to the people of the book will say, no, that's not true. You are inferior. Ours is the truth. And that idea is so strange in the East that you wonder, this must be an exception. We can't believe that a whole group of people would believe that. But that's how it is. And if from childhood you are programmed to think in those terms, that's all you end up with. And the authority is that the book was revealed. And because it was revealed by God, you have no right to question it. In the process, they also capture certain truths. Each word of the book, each syllable, each form of intonation has a deep truth to it. And you cannot pervert even a tiny part of those words. Now you can see how in the Vedic tradition there is a similar idea, that the Vedas represent a formulation of a revealed, inspired truth. But in the Vedic tradition itself, it is declared that the truth can never be reduced to words. In its very nature, it belongs to a domain which is above the thinking mind. And the moment you transcribe it in domain of thought and then word, which further reduces it, you have only caught an aspect. You have caught a reduction. So even though there is this idea of a revealed transmission which needs to be protected because it has something profound and deep, still it is made clear that after all that you have caught, what you have caught is a gateway and an entry point to the experience itself. And if you stop with the gateway, you miss the experience. But that truth, you can see how it's taken to an exaggerated position in the Abrahamic traditions, where now the formulation in the book is your teacher, is the Word of God, and there can be no other. Now, in the biblical tradition, the problem is not so difficult because the Bible itself has large components which belong to an age prior to Jesus. And that's put together as the Old Testament and the New Testament representing the revelation of Jesus. And the word Bible itself means only a collection of books, bibliography. It's a library of important books. It has gone through many stages of editing. It was gathered together 300 years after Christ, and many of the writings are well after him. So one can easily say, yes, it may not be exactly what was stated, and from Aramaic it has been translated into Greek, and then from there to English or Hebrew or whatever other languages, and you've lost a lot. All that can be easily stated in that case. But it is not so easy in Islam, where the original language and the form in which the founder of the religion received it has been retained, and even the forms of pronunciation and script to a great extent. And so there they can claim not only that this is the word of God, but in the very formulation of it, of the religion, it declares, and the last word of God. And this raises a bit of a problem. And you will recall this example I had given of a friend of mine who asks to people who speak like this, he says, which is greater? And he's speaking to his Christian friends because he's more close to them. He says, which is greater, the Bible or God? And the moment you accept God is greater, then you have to accept that there can be more to it than the book reveals. But if you put this in Islam, it's much more difficult. In Islam, the very formulation is, this is the last word of God, and Muhammad is the last of the prophets. There will be no other. So automatically it has declared its preeminence in a manner that no one else can come later and say, but now here's something more from God. It even co-opts the Christian tradition by claiming that Christ was also one of the prophets, as were all the other tradition. The more wide, inclusive attempts of Islam will say even Krishna and all the others were prophets of God. Avatars are only prophets. No, that's not quite the same thing, but they don't really worry about that. But Muhammad is the last, and therefore he overrides all others. And so built into the teaching is this self-affirmation in a manner that the divine authority can now no more be questioned. Again, you could ask the same question. Why would God stop communicating? If his communication to humanity is so important, why would he stop with one prophet? Why not reveal and continue to reveal in the new languages for the new development of mind at different stages of its understanding with a new vocabulary? And to a scientific mind, why not restate it in scientific terms? But the rigid framework of religion not only denies this, it must necessarily therefore declare there can be no change. The humanity of then is the same as the humanity of now. All you have to do is follow the book, and that's it. Sri Aurobindo, when he began to write the Arya, explicitly made this one of his objectives. There were 3 objectives, but one of his objectives was to restate the ancient truths of the past in terms relevant to the modern mind. In the Life Divine, for example, the book we are reading, there is a whole philosophical, rational, even a scientific formulation of things. And when he was asked, people said, you're a philosopher. Sri Aurobindo said, no, I'm not a philosopher. But I have had to articulate my experiences in rational terms because the modern mind is a rational mind. And so we see something very interesting here. The idea that as humanity evolves, as the consciousness of humanity evolves, and even the mind of humanity evolves, the divine truth, which in its origin and essence may be eternal, because it is above mind, needs to recast itself into the current mold of mind, into the current vocabulary of the people, and wherever it may express. If it expresses itself in Hindi, well, it will use a much richer vocabulary of Hindi than it might, let's say, for vocabulary of English, which has a smaller number of words, for example. Or if it had to express in French or German, it would be much richer range of perhaps greater precision of ideas than in English, where the word meanings are more fluid and less clear. And so even across language barriers, the truth needs to restate itself. And then within a community, within a culture, it needs to articulate from the perspective of the values of the people if it has to have any living meaning for them. And at each of these points, necessarily you will end up with different formulations, although from the same origin. But the moment you say this formulation, having come from that origin, is it and represents it completely, that's where you have the problem. So, the claim to determine the truth by divine authority opens it to denial. You can say, yes, but you fail because of this. Second reason he gives, divine authority, you will see particularly in the structure of Catholic Christianity, the Pope now declares himself as formally authorized by God. How? Well, there's a whole sequence through Christ perhaps, or through Saint Peter, who establishes the rock, the church, and so on. And then the whole lineage now from the Pope through his cardinal down to the local priest, authorized by the church, who can now speak on behalf of God. And that authority now challenges naturally human authority. And so you will see in the history of Europe many centuries in which the political authority conflicted with religious authority, and struggles between them, which led to the whole concept of secularism, separation of church and state, which has no relevance in India, where that didn't happen. And we'll see later why. You see a similar problem which can happen, but it was more easily resolved in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, where the Dalai Lama is at the same time spiritual authority as well as political authority. So there, the divine authority given is enough. But interestingly, there the divine authority does not come from God, because there is no God. There is rather an enlightened being who is as if the leader of his people, and his people recognize him as the enlightened being whom we respect and who will lead us to enlightenment. And it's a choice made. You could equally reject that and say, well, I will not follow you. And that's another redeeming element in Buddhism. It says, don't believe me because I am saying it. You think about it, come to your own conclusion. This is what I have to say, let's discuss. Because Buddhism is so rational in its formulation, and it is so extremely rational that it can even be declared or formulated in a manner as to be completely atheistic. And it actually says, so there is no God. Or it can say equally, there is the absolute, there is a poise of the Buddha, which is equivalent of God. And so it's a very interesting formulation that allows for complete rationality and an extreme of the irreligiosity. At the same time, it allows also a movement and opening of bhakti. But the fact that it has this fluidity causes a break in the tradition itself. And so you have the Mahayana tradition, where the Buddha is looked upon as the very embodiment of divinity, although the concept is differently worded there. And the Dalai Lama, in a sense, is one who has reached that height that allows him to teach others and help others. But there is no other compulsion. But still the sense of authority is there. The other variation of this idea comes with claim to determine truth by inspiration. And here it is not so much authority, but the fact that this person is open to an inspiration, and through the inspiration can give you the right knowledge. So you will see this in many smaller groups and often in cults which form around these centers. We have the old example in Greece of Delphi, where the oracle would as if plug into a divine source of knowledge and give you the right guidance. But there will still be the claim to determine the truth, not by authority now given by someone, but by the inspiration. And you'll find many movements like this which have started. In fact, most religions which had authority and claim to divine authority started first with an inspirational component. You find the same thing today among people. Now the problem with this is, it's not so much a problem of the claim of a person who has the inspiration, It's a problem of the people who value the inspiration and say, yes, so and so said it and it came true, therefore anything the person says must come true. And they give an authority greater than what the inspiration should deserve. You will see this now taking many other forms, less obvious forms, where you don't call it a religion anymore, but for example, with astrology. You went to an astrologer, the astrologer said, well, in 6 months your problem will change. Perhaps he gives you a precise date based on a numerical calculation. And the thing happens. So now you say, well, this fellow has the true knowledge. And so you now begin to consult more and become more and more dependent. Except that if you looked at the statistics of that astrologer, you might find he hits 50% or 60% precision in his dates, but the rest are failed. Just because it happened to you doesn't mean the rest of what he says is true. And then, as we have seen on other occasions, often the astrologer is a mind reader. He gives back to you what his intuition picks up from your mind. And so you say, he knew this, therefore whatever else he says must be true. There are many traditions within India which are called Nadi Granthas. You go to the person who has a text, he reads out from the text and says, you are born in such and such date, this is your name, you live in such and such place, this is what you're doing. Perfect precision of the past. And then, when it comes to the future, they pick a few elements. You're going to travel soon, watch out, be careful about whatever dangers which come with travel. And so you go away and actually you have some near misses and you say, wow, he was perfectly right for the past, therefore he must be right for the future. It came from a written book, it's printed text, so it must be frozen. Except, when you go back the second time, he says, you had come here 1 year ago on such and such a date, after this you have done these things. Now the text is telling you what you did in the last 1 year, but 1 year ago it couldn't tell you what you will do in the next 1 year. And so this is, Sri Aurobindo uses the word, that old dodge. When someone asks him about one such, which is called the Bhrigu Samhita, he laughs and says, oh, that old dodge. Meaning it's a trick. It's a game played on you. By reading your mind and feeding back to you your past, it created in you the conviction that what it says of the future will be equally precise, but actually it cannot. All it did was anyway read your mind. It didn't have everything written beforehand. Fate is not frozen and written on paper. But that sense of a knowledge that comes from inspiration can be so attractive, so deceiving, that people are willing to submit themselves. I know of a case where a friend of mine was in the real estate business and he narrated to me how someone came from Korea, South Korea, and he was on the telephone as he was vetting the space where he was to buy office space. And he was walking around on the phone talking to someone all the time. And so my friend asked him, what are you doing? Who are you speaking to? He says, oh, there's someone there in South Korea who is like my spiritual guide. And she is telling me right now, look to your right, there is a water tower, walk 10 steps in front, and here you'll see a tree. And she is on the phone, sitting in South Korea, precisely describing the landscape. And then she leads him to a point and says, here, this is where you should buy the land. Now the fact that the person has the ability as if to see what you're seeing at a distance is so surprising to the human mind that we are eager to say, oh, then they must know so much more. In fact, all they are doing is what you would do if you had a webcam attached to your head and they saw through your webcam and repeated to you what you were seeing. And that's what really happens. What your eyes see, what your mind sees, the person there picks up and feeds back to you and gives you the impression of the claim to a higher inspiration. So these are not at all true inspiration, all these examples. But where the true inspiration comes, we feel similarly obliged to follow. But the inspiration may be mixed, it may be incomplete, it may be insufficiently evolved in its higher perception. And especially when dealing with things of possibilities of the future, there are always variations which can lead to misses. So again, there the claim to determine the truth by inspiration fails. Third, by sacrosanct and infallible sovereignty given to it from on high. Someone has given this authority. So in the hierarchy of religions, you have this chain of authority given. And it is sacred and it is infallible. In the lineage of the Pope, it has often been declared by the popes that the popes are infallible because of the power vested by God. And there's an incident recently, I think the previous Pope, that when he came to power and was declared Pope, he felt such an inrush of the vitality and power of the authority. He said, earlier I had only heard about the infallibility of the Pope, and now I know that this is the case. So the authority given, it's sacred, you cannot question. And all of this, you can see how easily it leads to oppression of a people. Now what I want to point out, and this is very relevant for us, the same tendency can happen in any spiritual community, however genuine the intentions may be. And you will already see tendencies of this kind happening even with the mother's writings or Sri Aurobindo's writings. Someone will quote from the mother said such and such, and therefore now that becomes your fixed belief without recognizing perhaps the context in which she said it. And so mother herself would repeatedly say, don't hold me for the words I have spoken because I spoke them in a certain context. And even if I said such and such is my experience, in the next few minutes I have grown by miles ahead, and maybe next time you ask me the same question, I might give you a different perspective. So don't hold me back to specific words I had spoken at a certain state of consciousness. Now, that's of course her warning, because of the very recognizing that people would distort things. But you still have the experience. When she said something, you could feel the power of the words and the clarity of the inspiration and the intuition and the results which followed. Often, precisely. And so, the tendency to want to follow to the T would be there. But where would the failing come? Where might it come? When it concerns with changing circumstances. And mother herself said that she had to deal with those changing circumstances. Knowing where we have to go, it does not mean that the forms are fixed and you have to often develop the forms. When forming Auroville, for example, initially, there were many changes in the plans that she had to go through, some of them relating to current possibilities. Yes, ideally, 50 years from now, it should be like that, but right now you don't have those materials, you don't have those resources, and there's a sequencing sometimes where you have to first build a kith roof, and then later when you have the funds, you may build a concrete roof. But you can't start by saying, well, let's start with the concrete roof and maybe later something else, some other material not yet discovered. So there's an unfolding process in which you have to as if navigate the circumstances. And then there are opportunities. There was several times she said there were opportunities for large sums of money to come. And it was always some human agency that failed. It was the case of one person. He was an American who had come to the mother, or he was about to come. And the mother sent him a message, very peculiar message. You must come with $1 million. And so the fellow, he came here later and he told us, I didn't know how to raise $1 million. And so I don't know if he postponed the visit or he came later just like that. And after a few days, the mother asked Udar, what happened to that man whom I'd asked to bring $1 million? He said, I don't know how to get $1 million, so he's postponed his visit. And mother said, oh, that's a pity, because I saw $1 million waiting to come through him. Now, what that means is, on a higher level, what she perceived was in the realm of possibilities. Had he made the effort to look around even, there was an energy, a force that was trying to find the means to work out, and, well, he missed it. He didn't make the effort. So there are many such occasions where the human attempt slips, but you may see from a higher perspective an opportunity, and maybe it gets postponed or it's lost and circumstances change. There was another example where when she was trying to raise funds for the ashram, it was, I think, Ford of the famous Ford Motors, who had said after the Second World War, or towards the end of the Second World War, he said, if somebody can prove to me, give to me evidence of life after death, I will give half my fortune to that person. And mother said, I will do that. And so she sent word, and he was to make some arrangements, and then something happened because of the war, the whole thing got postponed, and he died soon after. But there were many such opportunities which mother spoke of, where human feelings, again when she started the handmade paper factory in the ashram, the agreements were made. It would have literally got millions of dollars from the United States at that time. The paper quality, the production was so good. But when the first batch was sent, it was badly packed. By the time it reached the US, it had got soggy with water, and the paper was destroyed, and the people on the other side cancelled their order. And that opportunity was lost because of human failing again. So I'm showing you something here, that you may tend to turn to that authority because you have seen where it works, but also you see where it fails. And it does not in any way reduce the value of that authority. But the problem is, after the mother's passing, people tend to want to hold that authority now on someone. And I've seen this happen to so many. They came to the ashram, they met with people in the ashram, and sometimes remarkable people, remarkably developed. We have this phrase we use here very loosely, great sadhaks. So what makes them great, I'm not too sure, but the fact that they've been here long enough gives to them something which you recognize as different, something special, and you sense an authority or an evolution which is more than normal. But the human tendency is now to want to give to them greater authority than they actually deserve. And the moment you do that, you're setting yourself up for all these different kinds of errors. Or, which you see later happening more recently, is the authority that comes with a position of power. Because this person has a position of power, naturally one tends to supplicate. And in supplicating, you also mix the spiritual component with the non-spiritual authority. So I had the occasion of a person who came from such a religious structure, from Akshardham. He was in the, they have a more hierarchical system. Their head literally, for them, embodies the absolute consciousness of the divine in a human form. And their founder was one who had realized that. And so in the sequence of inheritance, their head receives that position. So he came from a certain hierarchical background, and he said, I want to meet the head of the ashram. I said, the spiritual head of the ashram is the mother and Sri Aurobindo, but they are not in the body now. Yes, but you must have some body. I said, we don't have a spiritual head in the body. But you must have someone who manages things. I said, yes, we have a trust board which manages, but they are not spiritual head. They have only an organizational authority. So I said, okay, but I want to meet them. You see how it went from a spiritual position to authority. And so I arranged for that, and it was interesting. But the point was, it's easy to mix these two. And if you fast forward 50 years, easily that position could be identified with a spiritual position. Now, mother took great pains to ensure such a thing did not happen. In the very formulation of the ashram trust deed, she put no powers in the trustees. All powers were in her hands. But when she left her body, implied was that those powers were transmitted to the other trustees. You see the problem here. Often people complain, why didn't mother create a proper, clear structure of governance? And the answer is very simple. Had she created a governance structure, well, look, it could have been simply from elect someone. It could have been select someone. It could have been a combination of any of the governance systems which human mind can think of. Create any system. Give it enough time and people will slowly wriggle their way up the corridors of power, game the system, and finally seize authority. But once they've seized it, it will all be in the name of the mother declared this is how it should be. and now no one can question it. And so what did she do? She actually said this to Huta. After I leave my body, there will be no mother, there will be no Sri Aurobindo, there will only be the truth which will guide to the extent human beings are open to it. And she left no instructions of the management. She said, well, the consciousness of the people has to meet the truth and they will be guided, if they are sincere. And so implied is this: if you're sincere, you make the effort, well, you will be guided. If you're not sincere and you want to catch some truth and twist it to serve your manipulative, insincere objectives, well, you can do that, but you'll only be deceiving yourself. And with Auroville, she said similarly, decentralized. But she said the systems of governance will evolve as the consciousness of the people evolves. So straight away you have a framework where there's no fixed governance structure. The governance structure itself changes according to people's needs. And you have again to fall back on your sincerity to the truth, and according to that you will formulate what works for you in your current needs. And if we take that as the indication, that is how it should have been also for the ashram. So the tendency to slip into these errors, I am showing, is possible even now, even among the most self-declared half-awake or enlightened people. And there's no way to avoid it because it's a human failing. And so you see this tendency in religions. Give it enough time and you can see the extreme it can go to. Next, he gives a different series of authority that religion has claimed. It has sought to impose itself on human thought, feeling, conduct without discussion or question. Now, having had some authority, whether divine, inspired, or some given from on high, what does the authority do? It says that this is how you should think, this is how you should feel, this is how you should behave. If you want to be true to whatever authority or higher divine standard we are aiming for. Now you can see how it could start with a very good intention. The founder of the tradition, let's say, which becomes later a religion, or just some yogi who has a great spiritual experience, and around him a few disciples form who say, we want to learn, we want to grow with you, helped by you. Well, what does he do? He goes through a series of routines. There's the story, which is one of my favorite, demonstrating this. A story of a yogi who is living in the forest, and he happens to have a cat. And so while he meditates, the cat would used to paw him after a while because it got restless or it wanted food, so it would disturb him. And he said, well, I can't afford to have this disturbance. He would tie his cat to a pillar and do his meditation, and once he comes out, he would release the cat. So it went on for a while, and one day he told his disciples, I'm going for a pilgrimage, look after things. And he goes away, comes back after, let's say, a year, and as he looks for his little hut, he finds the whole part is surrounded by a large number of shops. And as he walks through the roads between the shops, trying to get back to his little hut, he finds all the shops are selling cats. And he goes to one of them, and the shopkeeper says, buy this cat, genuine descendant of the great yogi's cat, tie him to a pillar and you will get good meditation. The disciples, not understanding why he was tying the cat, took that as the ritual. That's the way you meditate. You tie your cat and then you get good meditation. And now you have the descendant's cat, which is sacred. So you must be getting the true meditation through the descendant. Now it's an exaggerated form of the story, but you can see how it works. You can see how easily one slips into exactly the same errors. And look at all the religions, this is what they have. The founder wore a certain dress, shaved his head, or because the religion grew in a desert land, the dress of the desert now becomes the dress of the religion. Or because the founder used to live in the mountains, he had a certain routine which now becomes the format of the religion itself. And some of these are so specific to the time and the climate that taken out of that context, they become oppressive. I've seen people wearing thick robes of 3 layers of clothing because the religion originated high up in the mountain in a very cold climate. But now they were living in a very hot climate, but they had to wear the same robes of the religion. And they were suffering, they would be perspiring inside, but there was no way out. And then, because the founder found it helpful to meditate so many times in the day, now the religion requires you to meditate so many times, otherwise, and so on. You see the same tendency, and I mentioned this recently in one of our classes, maybe last time, how in some place I found people declaring that you must repeat mother's name and the Nama Japa is the only way to realization or spiritualization. No, that's not what mother said, that's not what Sri Aurobindo said, but because someone found it helpful, that became the lead point for something. And the tendency again from the human mind, you see, Sri Aurobindo's formulation of the integral yoga is so rich, so diverse, because he spans the full spectrum of human types and human needs. And whatever your starting point, you begin with where you are and lead towards something which includes all of your nature. But somebody who found an aspect, an approach helpful, now can declare, this is what works, this is it. Somebody else says, that's what worked for me, this is it. And you'll find the groups separating. One who is more devotional, one who is more knowledge-based, one who is more action-based. And it forms like that, if you allowed it to become a religion. And of course, Mother's warning was always that if we don't make that mistake, if we remain sincere, she will not allow the religion to form. The tendencies will be there though, because of the human need. And so, inevitably, someone comes to the ashram, meets a respected sadhak, and says, how shall I practice the integral yoga? Or how can I include more and more in my life the values which we see and read about and we are inspired to follow? And the person says, well, start like this, do like that, do like that. What you have done in the process is suggested, not yet imposed, but suggested on human thought, feeling and conduct. But on the other side, the person goes home and says to his children, you must do like this, because that's how I was told. And now it's become not a suggestion, but an imposition, without discussion or question. So the problem is not the suggestion, not even the imposition. A guru could say to the disciple, look, I can see for you this is the way, I impose this on you. And maybe it's necessary, it's the only way you can bring in your unregenerate, undisciplined vital some sense of discipline by imposing on it something. Every day you must get up at 5, work for 2 hours chopping wood and drink the water from the well, and then you can rest. Imposed. But that's the way you're going to train the vital for that person. For someone else, it may be completely different. So he says the problem is not this thought, feeling, conduct imposed. The problem is it is without discussion or question. You are not looking at the type of the person to see what is suitable for you in your current context. Now you will, if you restate this in different terms, in a broader context of education, after all, yoga is also a form of education. It is an conscious, accelerated spiritual emergence, and so a form of education, where education primarily occupies itself with the mind and development of the vital and the mental. But still the same thing really. And so you will see in Sri Aurobindo's formulation of the 3 principles of true teaching, the first he says is nothing can be taught. And so how do you teach? You cannot teach. What you can do is evoke an experience, help the person to reach an experience or a realization. Exactly the same applies in the spiritual context, and especially of the integral yoga. You cannot impose, teach a spiritual state of consciousness. You can assist the emergence, the awakening or the experience or the glimpse of it by various means. Second, that the mind must be consulted in its own growth. You cannot teach the same way to everybody. You have to recognize the mold of the mind, its values, its priorities, its needs, its current state of evolution, and from there, in consultation, does this help you? Does this work? Does this interest you? And build from there. Now, the same thing works with the yoga also. Depending on the type of your nature, the next step or the current need of your development, you will formulate the next step. Or if the person sees deeply, the soul or psychic being is yearning for this, and the outer nature is blocking, preventing the deeper yearning from emerging, the person might even say, stop those things and follow this. And it may be like a shortcut, where you're literally compelling outer nature to suppress some of its rebellious tendencies to allow for the deeper to come forward. Or if the deeper wisdom says, you cannot bypass this, it's going to be too hard, it might create revolts, the person says, all right, take another year where you wallow in your current tendency. So there were many people who would write to Sri Aurobindo and say, we want to come and join the ashram. And Sri Aurobindo would say, not yet. 1 or 2 years pass and then he'll say, okay, now you're ready. What happened in those 2 years was their extended experience in life was enough to bring them to a point where certain tendencies were exhausted. And now they could genuinely say, all right, now this doesn't interest me so much and I can move forward. So the discussion or question through the thought, feeling and conduct has to take place before an imposition, if at all an imposition is made. Otherwise a suggestion is given, or many suggestions. Try this, try that, see what works. And then the third principle of true teaching, to grow from the near to the far. Again, you bring it in the context of the integral yoga. You start with that which is for you right now, in this moment, the easiest thing to do. To put yourself in relation to the divine. And if right now the easiest thing for me to do is to pick up a book and read something that I find elevating, we'll do that. If for you right now to go for a walk in nature and commune with the beautiful sky and the ocean is your way, we'll do that. And taking each moment as your entry point, and it can be a different entry point. Just now all I see is the beauty of this flower and its perfume, and suddenly my mind goes to the sense of what great divine wisdom works to make this beautiful. And that is my gateway to a communion with the divine possibilities. Or for someone else, it may be, I must go out and fight for justice, or for the trees, or for whatever it is, for the earth. And that's my way of feeling the sacredness of the earth as my mother. And that's my gateway to the Divine Mother. Whatever it is. In the moment, in the overall turn of your current development stage, which may last a few days or weeks or months and may change later, or in the current incarnation, which also has a unique slant, which is largely for this lifetime, within which you may have many variations. And that is where we will use the term svabhava, your temperament, your formed nature and its turn. What is the gateway for you most easy to relate to the divine? And so, going from the near to the far, you're not trying to do something which is out there, which is abstract for you. You're putting into practice at each moment that which leads you closer to the perception or the experience or the relation of the divine. So, always there's the need for discussion, for question, before one finds the right form in human thought, feeling and conduct. Without that, imposition will lead to only the denial, which says, but you cannot impose, or this imposition is harming me, and the failure of the religious effort. Now Sri Aurobindo shows you the problem of this whole approach. This authority, inspiration or sovereignty. This is an excessive and premature claim. The problem is not the claim, and the claim may be valid in its limitation. The problem is it is excessive. It is much more than what it actually carries. You may meet somebody and in the religious hierarchy of a particular lineage, recognize that the person is more evolved than you. And the hierarchy has taken the person higher up because of that higher evolution of some kind, some aspect. And so you may accept his authority, but not more than that, not excessive, not put him in place of the divine. Now you are my God, now I will bow down to you, and every breath of yours I will take as my life's mission. No, that would be the error. So there may be a claim, it may be helpful, but it cannot be excessive, nor can it be premature. It may be that something is evolving, it's emerging, but it's not yet come into its own. There is an intuition that glimmers, flashes occasionally, and we find that happen. We find that when it comes, it is great. But then to say everything the person says is now from that higher intuition, no, that's premature. So I've had occasions, and I will share without naming the person. It was a person who was here, a great teacher, a great man of great wisdom, formulating, teaching Sri Aurobindo's things, writings. Then he went elsewhere, he was there for a while, and I met him in a conference where he spoke. And the way he spoke was so extraordinary. Literally, he lit up the whole spectrum of reality, from the highest to oneness to the lowest in conscience. The way he formulated what the theme, it was literally as if it was lit up, and there was a sense of light, of revelation of a kind. I was so moved by that afterwards I went up to him and kneeled before him. One of the 2 or 3 people perhaps that I might have kneeled before in my lifetime, but I did that. And I was conscious as I was kneeling that I was kneeling to the inspiration that flowed through him and not to the person. But I couldn't help it because it was something so wonderful, so great. But I also recognized that he was not a container for that high light and inspiration all the time. That he had his other states which were not so high, and sometimes they could also take other forms, sometimes even petty human forms. And so we recognize what it is. But do not make that error, excessive or premature claim, not only from the authority but by us. We should be careful. Although this is an excessive and premature claim, although imposed in a way on the religious idea by the imperative and absolute character of the inspirations and illuminations, which are its warrant and justification, and by the necessity of faith as an occult light and power from the soul amidst the mind's ignorance, doubts, weaknesses, incertitudes. Now the justification for this is that it's imposed in a way on the religious idea by this imperative and absolute character of the inspirations. When the inspiration comes, it can be almost like a command and you cannot refuse. And the illumination that comes, like I said, I could not help it. I had to bow before it. Even if I had not done it physically, in my mind, in my heart, I had already bowed to the light that came, not to the person who was a vehicle. Of course, I will now respect the person because the light can come through him occasionally, not all the time, but still it is the light I respect, recognizing the vessel. So if you have, for example, a water pipe through which the water comes, you respect the pipe because it allows the clean water to come through, but you do not say the pipe is the water. That would be the error. But the character is so absolute when the inspiration comes. I've heard of other cases in other traditions where people have narrated to me how when the founder of their tradition would be seized by the inspiration, you could feel the entire space around him filled with this tremendous presence, palpably dense. And you walked into the aura and you couldn't help it. You were so overwhelmed. And whatever was said or done just swayed you by the sheer presence of that which came through. I've also heard of somebody else narrate in that same from that same community. When she first went there, she knew nothing. She didn't believe any of that stuff. She had gone because a few of her friends went and met this great teacher, and they came back impressed. But suddenly that evening, she got up. I think she was sleeping. I don't remember the details, but she got up. For no reason, she stepped out of her room and walked around, went to the house where the teacher was there. And after a while, someone came and said, now he is ready to meet you. And she said she walked in, climbed up the stairs, entered that room where the teacher was there, and she saw the teacher, translucent being of light, floating in the air. And it was such an intense experience. As she was narrating it, I could feel the vibration of what she experienced. And she had tears in her eyes as she narrated it. And she said that was it. It just happened once in my life. I experienced this extraordinary thing. Afterwards, I never experienced it again. I never experienced that presence with the teacher. But I stayed with him because there was nothing more I could do. And we asked again, but didn't you ever have any other contact? She said, no, I treated him as a great man, but that was about it. I never saw that which I felt and experienced on that one occasion. But that defined her life and even defined her spiritual journey. Now, this is a bit dramatic because it had a physical, visual character, but otherwise it may be purely in terms of consciousness without a miraculous component. The miracle tends to attract us more because we think that gives to it a greater stamp. But miracles can be imitated. People materialize objects, they can create shifts in forms, and it can all be done purely by vital means. It need have nothing of the spiritual character. Even the great sense of power and compelling feeling can be purely vital, which you feel often in the presence of a politician, or sometimes some of the great leaders of cults. They have a magnetic, charismatic power. Even many of the film actors will have that, and they seize upon people with that and sway crowds, and they enjoy it, but it has nothing of the spiritual character. And yet the spiritual power can have a similar result, but of a completely different quality. And I remember my teacher M.P. Pandit's sister, one of his sisters, narrated how when she first went to the darshan of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, it was the joint darshan, she walked up the stairs and she entered that space which you now see when you come out from Sri Aurobindo's room, where there is what is called the darshan room, where there is the photograph of the joint darshan. And in the room before that, she stepped in, there were people in the queue, and she said she looked around and she said, where is Sri Aurobindo, where is mother? I don't see them, I only see this tremendous light. Everything is intense white light, filling the whole room, so intense that you couldn't see anyone. Experiences of this kind. Panditji himself, when he had the first darshan of Sri Aurobindo, he said, in his presence, the only thing I could compare was the tremendous presence of the Himalayas. Something so massive as to represent infinity while still expressing through an individualized form. And the massive power of that, as if the whole infinite power and presence of the divine here is held. And for others, sometimes it was the aspect of the ananda, of the light, of the knowledge, or of an inner awakening where the inner being would leap out and everything else would be as if blanked out. So many had this experience that after their first meeting with the mother, they had the awakening of the psychic presence or the inner being came forward. And then for 3 days they say, we don't know what we did, we don't know how we went, I must have eaten food, I must have gone around, but I don't remember anything. I was in this totally dazed state of consciousness, and I don't know what I did. And after 3 days, gradually the thing receded, and the rest, what do I do? What do I do with this? Narad shared yesterday in an interview we had, where he said, my vital was too restless. I couldn't stay, but he knew he belonged to the mother, and that was it. I had met another person, and I've narrated this story before, and when I went to the US to a community, he heard I was coming from the ashram. He made it a point to meet me and shared his experience. He said he had come to Auroville for some work. Someone said, "Oh, you must meet the mother." He said, "Why? Old lady, what will I do? She's 90. What's there to see?" I said, "Okay, go anyway out of respect." He said, "Okay." So he went in, expecting nothing. He walks into the room and goes before the mother, and then something happened. He said, it was something so incredible. He looked into her eyes, and there was this tremendous pouring love and filling him, and it's as if layer after layer opened up, and he found himself bouncing around the whole universe. And the whole universe was filled with love pouring into him from all directions, and himself opening out to this. And he said, I asked him, "What did you experience?" "I don't know. It was as if layers and layers were opening up, and each layer was opening me to deeper love. But it was not a layer, it was as if something as large as the universe, which was being opened up layer by layer. And she bounced me around the universe." That's all he could say, with tears in his eyes. And of course he fell before her, kneeling. He came away, didn't know what to do. 3 days he was in a daze, and after his 3 days, he asked one of the secretaries to the mother, "What do I do?" And he said, "I don't think I can live in the ashram. I'm not sure I can join Auroville, but what do I do? After this experience, I can't do anything else. So what should I do?" So the message was sent to the mother, and mother wrote out a letter, not to him, addressed to the Dalai Lama, sending this man to Dalai Lama and saying, "Please," and told him, "You must go and serve the Dalai Lama." A very strange thing. You would have expected that he would have been asked to work for the mother. No, she saw what the soul's mission was. She had given to the person what was needed for his journey, perhaps the experience which will be the culmination of his journey, maybe in this life or maybe over a few lives. That whole thing was awakened, and then he was sent in where the soul's mission was. And the rest of his life he served the Dalai Lama. He was one of the persons responsible for his fame because he created documentaries around him and things like that. So I asked him, "Well, haven't you come to the ashram afterwards?" He said, "No." I said, "Why don't you come? It will be such a good thing." And after a lot of hesitation, he said to me, "I'm afraid." I said, "For what?" He said, "I'm afraid of being disappointed. Because the experience I had was so intense and so complete, it has sustained me the whole of my life. And if I go there and I don't have it, it would be disappointing." And I got his point. I said, "Yes, you're right. This is what it is." She gave him what was needed, and the power given, you can see it has the absolute character of the inspiration and illumination, and it warrants this, justifies this, and it has defined his whole life. And to this day, his reference is not the Dalai Lama, it is this experience that the mother gave him. But then she assigned it to him to serve the Dalai Lama. So that's what he's doing. And by the necessity of faith as an occult light and power from the soul amidst the mind's ignorance, doubts, weakness, incertitudes. So first character is the absolute character of the inspiration and illumination. That compels you. But the other side, which justifies this sense of higher authority, is that your mind is so full of ignorance, so full of doubt, so full of weaknesses, and all the time uncertain. Even when it thinks it knows, its knowing is clouded by doubt. Maybe I'm wrong. What if I'm wrong? And so you need a deeper light of the soul. And if you have to persist and survive in the midst of the demands of life with the weaknesses you have, you don't have the strength. You need the soul's power to take you through it. And if you do not have the soul's light for knowledge and the soul's power for strength, you cannot go through to fulfill what you have to do in life. The fact that you need that, but the fact that the soul's light and power are hidden, bring this challenge. So the necessity of faith as an occult light and power from the soul amidst the mind's ignorance, doubts, weakness, incertitude. So when the soul's light and power are there, but they are covered up, they are occulted, they are hidden, you need faith, which is its representative on the surface. But what is faith? Faith is not belief. But it is what the religions catch. They speak of faith, but they translate it as belief. You must have faith in the book. You must have faith in your priest. You must have faith in the teaching. You must have faith that God will somehow do it. No, that's not faith. That's belief. Faith, Sri Aurobindo says, is the deeper knowledge of the soul. But it may reflect in your mind, in your heart, sometimes even in your actions, in a deeper form of knowledge which you cannot explain why, but you just know it. I know that I will be taken care of. I know that I will be protected. I know that this will work, even though everybody says it's not possible. That deeper knowing, if you begin to question, you cannot explain it. You cannot rationalize it. Or perhaps you can translate it in rational terms, but the knowing itself is not rational. And even though everything in the world may be against it, everyone may criticize you for it, when you have that clarity, you say, yes, but I know. And nothing can take it away. That's the true sense of the faith. And it can be in the sense of a tiny drop, but that's enough to give you the light or the strength as if even against the whole world. But of course, it's not always against. It's just, it knows and it does. Sometimes also there is something against it, but it doesn't matter. And a form of it we experience all the time in the faith in which you know that you exist. You can of course doubt this question. Do you know that you exist? Maybe I'm imagining the whole world. A lot of theories now which come up from quantum physics, which are very fanciful in the new age teachings, they'll say, the world doesn't exist actually, it's all a creation of your mind. They take the Buddhist ideas and formulate it around quantum physics to give to it some credibility of science. The universe doesn't exist, it's all an illusion, it's all created by your mind, and if you close your eyes it ceases to be. Even I've heard Deepak Chopra say that. And behind that, the idea that somehow, and they'll use the scientific word simulation, it's a great simulation. Who's simulating it? Who's the computer which is simulating? That brings it to a bigger problem. That's your God. But they don't want to get into that. It's a simulation. Throw in the catchword from science. And so, it's just an illusion created by your mind, your expectation. And then the consequences, whatever you truly believe will happen. But it's error of the mind. You're giving to mind the authority which the soul has. The truth is, it is the soul's true experience of reality, of itself, which is the divine. And to that extent, it's a simulation, you may say. But it's a real simulation. To that extent, what the soul wills will happen, because it is the freedom of the soul which is what we call fate. Because it shows things have to happen. It's not the mind, but you've given to mind that authority, and so you've kind of lost your way or made an error out of a truth. So you can believe all you want, it's not going to change reality. But if you know in the soul's knowing something, well, it will happen because it is already true at the level of the soul. So we see two reasons why this diviner authority and the tendency for us to give and accept that authority comes. First, because of the absolute character of the inspiration and illumination, and second, because we need faith as an occult light and power from the soul amidst the mind's ignorance, doubts, weaknesses, incertitudes. And because we need that, we seek for that. And we seek for it outside us. Or we catch something within us in a moment, and then we want to now generalize it to all occasions. Now, this faith which is the starting point and the deepest need within us, without which we cannot navigate life. Of this, Sri Aurobindo now says something, why it is important, where it comes from, and what is the truth of it. Faith is indispensable to man, for without it, he could not proceed forward in his journey through the unknown. But it ought not to be imposed. It should come as a free perception or an imperative direction from the inner spirit. What religion did was it caught something of this truth and then imposed it. What is needed instead is the true nature of the faith, which is, it comes from within. Imperative direction from the inner spirit, I know and I have no choice but to follow, or comes as a free perception, something in me sees and therefore I know. Either of these. It ought not to be imposed. Again, the suggestion, Sri Aurobindo is very precise with words. It ought not to be imposed. Ought not, suggesting sometimes it can be. There are exceptional situations where it can be and it should be even. And without that imposition, you cannot transmit a higher possibility. When the disciple is awakened to that greater reality in the first experience of contact with the Guru or with the revelation, it is a faith that is awakened, that is almost in a sense imposed. Mother said when people came to her the first time, she would bore through all the layers, go down all the way to the psychic being, and whatever was the highest aspiration of the person's psychic being, she would give to it the push necessary for its fulfillment. And generally, she would also bring forward the psychic influence and awaken it. And so people would have this extraordinary shift that would take place. And afterwards, gradually, of course, the outer nature goes back to its old ways, gradually screens and covers up, comes back to normal and then functions. Now freed from this state of unbalanced or overwhelmed awakening. So I remember there was one businessman. He had only that as his priority. He had no real spiritual interest, but he had come to the mother. And he said in the first meeting with the mother, she looked deep into him and then he saw his whole being open up and he saw the light within. And for the rest of his life, he was just seeking that. Who will give me the light? He never sought to recover the experience himself. What she had given was actually an experience. He could have got it himself again. But he was looking for people who will give me the light. And of course, he got in the board of many different traditions, many famous people. And to the end, he was looking for the light. But that, it's a form of imposition. But that's the gift that you may receive, which defines the journey of your life and gives you a reference. It may come directly from the divine with no human intermediary. It may come through the human intermediary. It ought not to be imposed as a rule, except where there are exceptions, where something is necessary, and it is seen also from the higher poise. And we may even say the mother is inspired from that higher inspiration to act, to intervene where necessary. And when she is aligned to be absolute instrument for the divine will, well, it is the divine inspiration which intervenes for that. Equally, there were people who went and met her and shook hands and said hi and bye and came away and said, oh, nice lady, she has big teeth. I've seen that in a publication. Someone wrote that. That's about it. That's all he had. And then there are people who had this overwhelming experience. They read that and say, what is this? How is it they didn't have that experience? Because it was not necessary, or even that it could have harmed the person's evolution to have intervened to awaken prematurely, something for which they were not yet ready, and a long preparation was necessary. So this is what he has to say. Faith is indispensable to man, for without it he could not proceed forward in his journey through the unknown. Something in us knows that we will get there. Something in us knows this life is not by chance. Something in us knows we have something important to do, although we don't know what. Something in us knows that we will know what to do when the time comes, even though right now we don't know what we have to do. All of these things are within us. And if we trust that and if we follow that guidance, the faith leads us. And without it, we would look at the world and say, impossible, and just sink and collapse. But this faith is there and it leads us. And even though we may not be conscious of it, it is there. And it often takes warped forms in an aggrandized, egoistic vital that says, I can do anything, I will conquer the world. No, that's a distortion by the vital of the faith that says, I can do whatever I know I am required to do. The mission for which I have come will be fulfilled, come what may. And that knowledge of the true faith reflects in the vital with the exaggerated perversion, etc. So that's why he says it is indispensable. We couldn't proceed without it. And a claim to unquestioned acceptance could only be warranted if the spiritual effort had already achieved man's progression to the highest truth consciousness, total and integral, free from all ignorant mental and vital mixture. So the claim that religion had that says you must follow without questioning is actually right if the consciousness had gone all the way to the highest truth consciousness and it was complete, total and integral, without the mixture of the mind and vital. Then you could have that, but we are nowhere near that in anybody in human nature so far in evolution. That's why we had religions. We didn't have the full spiritual awakening. And Sri Aurobindo points out that wherever a light comes like this, the tendency of religion will form. And even here, it will form, the tendency. But, he says in the Life Divine, and these will be Gnostic communities, he says, if the truth is strong enough and complete enough, it will find its way around these distortions. And in spite of these human tendencies, it will repeatedly renew itself, renew its forms, and take all the way. Such is the promise we have, and that's why Sri Aurobindo's effort to establish the supramental consciousness first. It could have been done more easily by intermediate steps, but each of those would be flawed. Unless you establish that highest truth, the tendency for these deviations and distortions would be inevitable. And so we have, in spite of whatever appearances may be, however confusing they may be, if we put ourselves, and this is the point for all of us individually, if we put ourselves in relation to the divine, to the highest consciousness of the divine, from the highest center within us, from the deepest center within us, as far as possible, as entirely as possible, as exclusively as possible, then it will lead us. It will help us to grow more complete, more deep, more true. It will help establish, deepen and strengthen this essential faith which is already there as the soul's knowledge within us, and lead to our fulfillment through the otherwise complex byways of life, through the maze of life, we may say. So all of this and the next two sentences which complete the paragraph, we will take up the next time that we meet, which will be not next Sunday but after a little over a month, because I will be out of station for a while, and we will resume this on November, just a minute, I have to get the 24th November, excellent. It's on the Darshan day. There is the March Past on that day. For those of you, if you're... So what shall we do? Shall we just have this session anyway? Anybody going to the March Past? Probably not. Okay, so we'll have the session as usual, 6 p.m., 24th November. And the Friday class will be on 22nd November. So we can take a moment to dwell on this. The truth that the religious form represents, but which is perverted by the form, and especially what it means for us and the importance of the soul's knowledge and the faith which is indispensable. And responding to the faith is, of course, the divine grace that comes with the call from within us. We can briefly concentrate on it for a few seconds. will continue this next time, which will be 17th November, which is also Darshan Day. So it will be, yes, I'll be back on the 16th. So 17th November, we will meet again at 6 p.m. as usual.